The original ideas in my lab did not come from my brain, but from the brain of the young people whom I was so fortunate enough to recruit. Hallmarks of Cancer 2011, the new generation, actually attracted a lot of interest. Maybe even 50,000 citations. We still have lots of life-threatening cancers that were life-threatening 25 years ago and remain life-threatening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OncoDaily. Today, it's an extreme honor and a pleasure to have one of the life legends of the medicine and specifically oncology, Professor Bob Weinberg, with us. I mean, anyone entering the field of oncology, the first names appears on their papers, and certainly it's Dr. Weinberg. And I mean, everyone knows the hallmarks of cancer, everyone knows the discovery of oncogenes, but I'm not going to go deep further because he certainly doesn't need introduction, especially in the oncology field. And we'll explore this during our discussion. Thank you, Professor Weinberg, for being with us.
Well, many thanks for the honor of being here.
Thank you. I'll go back from your early days. Why science? Why did you begin with science? How your early career evolved?
It was a series of accidents. Most people have a series of goals in life. I just take one step after another. Children of friends of ours, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, sent their kids to MIT for undergraduate education. My parents said, "Why don't you try MIT?" So I was admitted, and so I got an MIT undergraduate education where I found lots of interesting things to learn about, but most importantly, experienced the molecular revolution of biology as it was occurring in the mid-1960s. So that explains much of how I ended up where I am.
Then, please, can you tell a bit more? I want to ask some of more your details from the early years. What were the challenges? Some of the things which usually you don't tell during the interviews.
Sure. Well, I worked on some rather unambitious, uninteresting molecular biological problems, like what was the structure of mammalian RNA. I worked then on different tumor viruses, not because they cause cancer, but because they have interesting molecular biological attributes that made it easy to study certain molecules such as messenger RNA. And then in the late 1970s, I became interested increasingly in cancers that were not induced by viral infection, but rather induced by certain mutagenic exposures. And that led in 1978 to my laboratory beginning to look for genes that were mutated in cells that had been exposed to chemical carcinogens. And that led us in turn in 1979 for the first time to be able to show that in certain cells that had been transformed from a normal to a neoplastic state, that in those cells one could find mutated genes that were responsible for the neoplastic phenotype of the cells, the cancer cells, and therefore could be considered, as we now call them, oncogenes. So that was my entrance with both feet into the field of molecular oncology. And by the way, the most important thing I ever did in my career. Everything else was relatively minor, in my opinion, compared with that 1979 work, which is a bit depressing given the fact that it's already 45 years ago.
It's very difficult to find another person with the track record you have. But what was key to your success?
Well, one thing that was key to my success was being recruited back to MIT, because in the end, the big difference between successful and not so successful laboratories is not the characters of the individual scientists who are leading the labs. Obviously, that helps, but their ability to recruit smart, ambitious, hardworking young people. And here, the playing field is not level. It's not fair. If you're at MIT, it's easy to recruit excellent young researchers. If you're working in the middle of United States, for example, the flyover countries, as they call themselves, it's much more difficult. And so being at MIT, I was poised to be able to recruit some very smart young people, and that made all the difference. Indeed, many of the good ideas, the original ideas in my lab, did not come from my brain, but from the brain of the young people, whom I was so fortunate enough to recruit.
How you were recruiting? I mean, what the criteria were for you? For you, like, what are the main criteria to be on the Weinberg's team?
Well, I didn't actually go out and recruit people. People wrote to me, and then I began to do some research into them. One of the issues that was important for me was, could I find indications of intelligence and originality? Equally important was that they were actually good people to work with. They were pleasant people. They were not disruptive. They were not so enamored by their own intellects as to disrupt the actions and the interactions within a laboratory. And so I think that ended up being a reasonably good policy. Often I received letters of recommendation about a candidate postdoc, and the letter said, this person is very smart and has gotten this and that done. And I called back the person who wrote the letter and I said, well, that's all very good, but I don't sense any indication about his or her personality. How easy are they to get along with? Of course, in science, many people think the only important thing is to have a good brain and work hard. But for me, science was always a social activity. And to the extent that I retire, which will happen soon, it will mean that I miss the interactions with the young people who make and who have made my life interesting and enjoyable.
Before coming to your mentees, some time ago I was interviewing Robert Peter Gale, and he made some expression which I think many would do. Is like he said, "We are standing on shoulders of giants." On whose shoulders you are standing?
Well, that's a frequently used phrase for people who wish to cast themselves in a humble light. There are a number of shoulders I sit on. There were people who in the 1940s already began to speculate that cancer cells were mutant cells. There's a number of those. Obviously, Watson and Crick, I stood on their shoulders. That is, that DNA is a genetic material. Watson, in fact, lived until this year. He found the double helix in 1953 and just died now in 2025. Quite remarkable. So I stood on them, and then I stood on a large number of molecular biologists who, by the mid 1960s, had begun and continued to do until the mid 1970s to characterize the molecular biology of mammalian cells. That too was critical because it enabled certain experiments to be undertaken that really distinguished them from, for example, prokaryotic cells. So there was a whole field of science which I was surrounded by. And I should add a second feature of being in a place like MIT. Not only could I recruit good people, but I could learn from my colleagues around me at MIT, from other laboratories. There was a lot of cross-fertilization going on. To this day, I force people in my laboratory to attend weekly meetings where we learn what's going on in other laboratories. It's an obligation of them to go every week, whether they like it or not. So I want my people to become generalists rather than simply deeply enmeshed in what they've been working on.
What about your mentees? I mean, I'm sure you have thousands. Who are your mentees?
Well, I have maybe altogether 100 over all these many years. They're scattered across the world, all the way from China to Israel to Europe. Majority in the United States. The majority of them have entered into research into preclinical cancer research. Some of them have gone into clinical medicine, relatively few, and many of them have become academics in the sense of teaching biology in various institutions of higher learning. in this country and in Europe.
So when I was talking to some of your mentees, they said like everyone has a Weinberg story. So everyone, yeah, I mean, everyone is like kind of this part of their journey or their life. It's so light and bright that like when you talk to them, like the smile comes to their face. And I mean, it was a short period that I listened to your lectures, but it was the same. I mean, even with that short period of time, I was able to get my Weinberg story.
Ah,
You were when we were just beginning to speak, you asked me where I am, so it was related to that. The Hallmarks of Cancer paper
yes.
fundamentally changed how the world understands cancer. And I mean, what was the process behind it? How this all started?
It all started going back to MIT because Doug Hanahan and I were both alumni of MIT. We had both undergone an undergraduate education studying physics and chemistry. We were both immersed in the idea that a field of science should have some basic underlying, broadly applicable rules. Yet, biology, when we started these discussions, seemed to have no number of significant underlying principles. It was just a hodgepodge of different phenomena. One elderly, cynical cancer researcher said to me, a Brit he said to me, don't ever confuse cancer research with science. Uh, and the reason he said that was because it was a large collection of disparate, diverse phenomenologies. And Doug Hanahan and I were at a meeting in Hawaii. We were playing hooky. And left the meeting and climbed up the side of a volcano, a dormant volcano, I would add, because I'm still here. And we began to have this conversation. And during this trip, we said maybe there are some principles of cancer that we could also enunciate that would be as important as, for example, Newtonian laws for physics. And so that was our goal. But we never had an invitation to publish any of this thinking until I got an invitation from the editor of Cell in 1999, who said, we'd like to invite you to write a review article for Cell for the new millennium. And that was the source of the Hallmarks of Cancer. By the way, when one writes a review article, such as the Hallmarks of Cancer, one typically expects that the review article will disappear, as I often say, like a stone thrown in a quiet pond. But much to my amazement, it and its successor, Hallmarks of Cancer 2011, the new generation, actually attracted a lot of interest, maybe even 50,000 citations. Now, one may debate whether it was because it was such a fundamental innovation in thinking, or because it had so much information in it that it spared many authors the pain of having to cite a whole series of papers in the literature by just citing one paper. I cannot know. In any case, it's certainly flattering to know that actually it caught people's attention.
Well, I think it's up right now. It's the most cited paper ever, right? If I'm not mistaken, the first one.
In the history of the universe, I don't know, but it's the
The
most cited
history of
over the last decades. Yes. Again, I'm equivocal about why it's cited because many people simply cite it because it spares them the painful labor of having to look up lots of different references.
If you look at cancer biology today, which advances do you find the most exciting or paradigm shifting, and how do you see the field evolving in the next 5-10 years?
Well, cancer research, and therefore also, to state the obvious, clinical cancer, is kind of, for the moment, stuck in the mud, basically. We still have lots of life-threatening cancers that were life-threatening 25 years ago and remain life-threatening. We know an enormous amount about what propels these cancers forward, but we still have rather limited means to actually cure them. Perhaps we can delay the inevitable death coming from these cancers, but never achieving a cure in the case of many cancers, such as pancreatic cancer, many kinds of stomach cancers, esophageal cancer, and so forth. So in that sense, it's a bit frustrating. The one hope I have for the future is that immuno-oncology, that is the ability to treat cancers with various kinds of immunotherapies, offers hope for the future. So I think that is for me the most exciting area because of its continuing innovations.
If you look back in the days when all these discoveries made, I don't know, starting from the early 50s and then going on, the discoveries, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but in my opinion, they were very fast. And then the pace, although we are developing too fast, we have all these tools, I don't know, computers, AI, everything. But now we don't do that many discoveries, the real discoveries that we say, oh, aha, this is really a discovery, than we had in the past. What's the, I mean, if you think so, I mean, what's the reason and how we can change it?
Well, you're pointing out to a great disparity, a disconnect in modern current biomedical research. I often ask people, why do they work on this problem or that problem? And they say, well, I can get lots of data. I can accumulate large amounts of information about this cancer or that cancer. And then I ask them, well, what are the take-home lessons? What have you learned from these enormous data sets? And there they mumble a little bit and walk away without answering, because often our increasing knowledge doesn't lead to concomitant increased insights. For me, an insight is something that you can explain, a take-home lesson that you can explain in 2 or 3 sentences. And many of those insights are few and far between at present.
I mean, so what would be your advice to a younger generation who are looking into the field and want to enter here and want to become the next Bob Weinberg?
I wouldn't wish on them becoming the next Bob Weinberg. They should become themselves. Bob Weinberg is no paradigm for a goal. I would urge them to think about the following: that their science and their experiments should be dedicated to generating new insights that can be articulated in 2 or 3 sentences. As I said before, you can explain what you've learned. To the extent that all one can do is generate large data sets, for me, that's a bit unsatisfying. Obviously, you can't always generate take-home lessons of the sort I've just alluded to, but those should really be the end goal of science, even if they cannot arrive at them instantaneously. And so people need to be motivated to choose experimental paths that will allow them to generate new insights that can actually be described in prose, or as I call them, take home lessons.
I want to go back to the initial discussion, and I want to ask about your family.
My family.
Yes.
Well, I belong to an ethnic group like the Armenians that's been chased across the globe in various epochs. In fact, it is said that the Armenians and the Jews look a lot alike. I cannot comment on that, but simply to say that I came from a family of German Jews who got out of Germany in 1938. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my first language was Eastern Westphalian German. And I spoke that long before I spoke English. And to this day, if I speak with relatives, I often use German rather than English. If I think about the history of the Armenians in Turkey, I can think of a very similar kind of fate, that is referring to the Armenian Holocaust, which was grim and also probably led to the deaths of a significant proportion of the Armenians in the Middle East. So there are similar histories, obviously propagated from different ideas and in different settings, but it's not an altogether happy thing to think about. I'm very invested in what my ancestors' lives were like in Germany over the last 300 years and why they suffered ultimately the fate that they did, something I still cannot understand to this day.
Thank you. Outside of oncology, which passions or hobbies you like, or you keep your balanced, or
Well, I in 1975, When I met my wife, I showed her a piece of land that I had just bought in New Hampshire, and I pointed to a spot and I said, "On this spot here, we're going to build a cabin." And she looked at me as if I was a wild man. But sure enough, soon we started building our cabin. And so as the cabin grew, I learned skills of carpentry and electrical work and plumbing and roofing and installing windows. So if you need a house built, Weinberg should be your man, an expert in the skills of home building. And I've continued to have that interest, along with the adjacent skill of gardening. I do a lot of gardening as well. And so after 50 years, we actually have a pretty nice place in the woods of New Hampshire, which is my passion. I think
That
actually that if I didn't have this alternative, I would have been a very different person, because it's good, to my mind, it's easy to say, but it's good to be able to escape from one's professional life, and move into an entirely different world that demands different skills and different types of interactions with people. One of the things that it taught me was actually there's lots of people in this world who are highly intelligent, very competent, as indicated by the way they build, they use their hands, but they don't show up in academia, which is a humbling idea.
which books you would suggest that everyone reads?
Books that everyone reads. Well, I could be self-aggrandizing and say for an entering student, is that whom you're talking about?
No, in general, I mean the books which made a profound impact on you and you would recommend everyone, if there are.
Maybe The Double Helix by Watson and Crick. Maybe a number of textbooks. I actually published a textbook, The Biology of Cancer, that has been well received. I don't mean to promote that, because that would seem to be a little self-aggrandizing, but I'm giving you an honest assessment. In order to do good cancer research, people need to have a pre-existing rigorous education in molecular biology and cell biology and genetics. Simply jumping in with both feet is not going to land them into a very propitious position where they can really start advancing quickly. There needs to be a pre-existing underlying and highly cultivated expertise in biochemistry, cell biology, genetics, and all the other aspects of modern biology.
What is your leadership style? How you were able to lead the group? So not only just making discoveries, but also leading the groups.
Well, one of my leadership styles, I don't think of myself as a leader. In fact, years ago, a vice president of MIT said to me, "Bob, why don't you move yourself into a leadership position?" And I said to him, he had a thick Greek accent, I said, "Constantine, I'm not a leader of men." And he looked at me like this and said, "What are you then, a leader of women?" he was he was very humorous. To the extent that I have some kind of leadership style, it's kind of a when somebody comes new to my lab, I ask them to sit at work, talk with everybody in the laboratory, and then come back to me 2 or 3 weeks later and ask them what would they like to work on. And there's a series of ideas they'll propose. In one, I'll say, well, that's totally unworkable. It won't happen. Or I'll say somebody else in the lab is already working on it. And the worst thing you ever want to have is intra-laboratory competition. Or I'll say, actually, that's very original. It may be rather challenging, but let's see what happens over the next 6 months. But I intentionally allow them to develop their own research trajectory so that they can take ownership of what they're doing. When people leave my lab, they take their projects with them, because they have worked on them and they own them in my eyes. So that's part of my style of leadership, which in the end has the goal of making the people who leave my laboratory independent researchers. That's the long-term goal. And if I do not succeed with one of my trainees or another, then I think of myself as having failed.
If you describe in one sentence, who is Bob Weinberg?
A short, stocky, noisy Jew.
Thank you very much. And I'll ask my last question, which I usually ask all my guests, who I should interview next.
Whom you interview next? Well, maybe you should interview Doug Hanahan, with whom I collaborated. He's in Lausanne, Switzerland. He's a very interesting man. In terms of a biochemist, you might wish to interview a former colleague of mine. His name is David Sabatini. He's now in Prague. You might wish to interview someone in genomics, such as, for example, Todd Golub, Golub, who's at the Broad.
Yeah.
You may wish to interview somebody like Charles Swanton, Swanton. He's in the UK for genetics. That's already a pretty good starting list.
Very good. Very good list. Thank you so much. It was really a great pleasure.
It's my pleasure. Snoragalathon.
Thank you so much. The only thing that I remember from the Hebrew is Bavagasha.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It is continue, right? Bavagasha. Okay.
You're most welcome.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
A good day to you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to OncoDaily on YouTube. Hit the bell icon to stay updated.